All right. So excited about today's recording. I have Andrew Anobly and Nate Gibbs back with us and about a really cool subject we're going to talk about. But first, just wanted to introduce you to them. Some of you might know Nate from previous recordings, but all of us went to seminary together and we pretty much lived all in the same house, actually, right?
Yeah.
Jeff, us not at the same time, but Nate overlapped with both of us.
Yeah. Because my wife and I live in an apartment below where you guys lived.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we had this giant house, so we got a super deal on, and we're able to live next to the river. So we had lots of fun parties, hanging out with everyone there. So good memories. Yeah, so today, and about Andrew. Andrew, how do you know us?
So Jeff and I actually met through our mutual friend Ivan up at seminary, and Jeff was living in this house, and we ended up just hanging out. And then one day, I think it was a Friday night, actually, he had some people over at the house, and Jeff and I just started talking about life and talking about meaning, and all of a sudden we just started connecting. And it hit me, and I know I've talked with Jeff, I know I've talked with you. It hit you too, where we're like, okay, this is a person I'm going to connect with.
Right.
And so from then on, from my first semester there, I believe it was your third semester there, we were just hanging out. We became good friends. So yeah, that's how I got connected with you.
And then Nate was downstairs, and he was part of the household. We come up and have these deep theological discussions all the time, and he would impart to us his knowledge.
Right. And Nate and I actually were SSF presidents together. That's the Seminary Student Forum. So Nate and I would end up connecting that year as well. And then we were serving the seminary together. So all of us are definitely connected.
We met in Hebrew class, though. That's what
we did. The first summer.
My first
class. My first class ever. Nate was kicking my butt. So
like every class.
Yes.
Just don't take a class with Nate if you want to get the best grade. So that's our connection. There's a lot more there, but yeah, I just wanted to kick off, and I want to ask you guys something that it's been a big part of my journey, and something theologically that's been a kink in my mind that I've been, I guess you could say, been working out philosophically, theologically, biblically, and that is this idea that I heard this verse when I was young, and that is that the heart is deceitfully wicked above all things. Who can know it? And out of this idea that the heart is evil, many people have built this idea that, to be a Christian is basically to deny your feelings, deny your heart, deny pleasure, become more monastic and just super introspective to the point of like not engaging in the world around you, being like an ascetic, someone that sits on a pole and disconnected from the world, and kind of their views of God are kind of like that too. So can I be a Christian and have feelings? There's so much in there to unpack, and this isn't scripted. We had a little discussion, but I'm just throwing this out there and love to hear your guys' thoughts.
That's a great question, Jeff. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Nate, you want to go ahead and start us off?
So I don't even know where to begin. Where do you want me to begin? Because there's so much. Like so for me, the idea, I remember becoming, and you don't even think about this when you're in the world. So I was not always an Adventist, wasn't always a Christian. You don't really think about whether or not emotions are bad or good.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere along the line, that idea kind of no one actually told me that, but through like almost like Adventist osmosis, you kind of picked up this idea that the emotional is bad. And I don't know where it comes from. And maybe it's in Christianity in general, because I just wouldn't know, because I went from, a kid in the church in a different denomination, atheist. So as a kid, you're not thinking about this stuff, atheist, and all of a sudden I'm an adult member as a Christian, in the Adventist context, so I don't know outside of Adventism if emotions are looked down upon. I do see some of that in other writings of Christians, other theologians, the way they write kind of and argue the emotions are put down. But anyways, it just started like, even to the point that like someone will be like enter the room and they'll be emotional, and then someone next to you is like, oh, don't worry about them, they're just emotional, as if that means they're wrong automatically. And then just other things, like if you have an emotion about something, a feeling, and you're talking through with someone, you're like, well, you can't trust your feelings. And it's true, that's not false, but at the same time, it doesn't mean you can't, that does not mean that you should be without feeling. We're not like, the goal that is not to be a Vulcan in Star Trek, because even in that, even the idea of the Vulcan and all that all playing out with Spock and all that, the idea there was the reason why Captain Kirk was better than Spock at things was because he had emotions, because that was what made him human. He had like a gut, and he could went on, and the pure logic of the Vulcan always didn't work out. So even in that show, which is secular, it was working out this idea that emotions are part of what makes us human. So to deny that would be a huge problem.
Well, and it's interesting that you say, Jeff, the heart is deceitful above all things, because even in scripture, we get this idea of it being two sides of the coin. Because in Psalm 37:4, it says, delight yourself in the Lord and he will grant you the desires of your heart. And so, while we have that on one end, we also have this idea on the other end of that God, wants you to experience that emotion. And that if you experience it in a positive way, or a moral way, I should say, it's good, and it's a good thing. And it appears that emotions are a good thing. And later in the New Testament, we're told that to love the Lord your God with all your mind and heart, connected. And so the interplay of the two. And so I think for me, emotions are amoral. Emotions can be positive, emotions can be negative. It's the overreaction and the overuse of emotions in inappropriate ways that is not good. However, to state that emotions are bad is to state that humans, as they were created by God in his image, are bad, because having emotions is necessarily a part of the human made in the image of God. And even Jesus, who came down and lived a perfect life, experienced emotions.
What? Really?
And came into the world having an emotional experience. And the most obvious one that is usually stated is his anger in the temple, when he's clearing out the temple. But you also have in John 11 him weeping, and it says being groaned and troubled because of the reaction and the emotions. Like, so you can see clear empathy from Jesus. Empathy being the key word of the empath and the emotional experience Jesus is having. So to say that having an emotional experience is wrong is to say what Jesus did was wrong, which is automatically you're gonna have to figure yourself out. And as far as in a Christian context, okay, which one are you gonna want to stick with?
So it was interesting that you bring up this idea that emotions are amoral, that there's not, they're not either good or nor bad. And I think even to top it off, because what people then do, well, there's good emotions and bad emotions, and they start splitting them off into, well, happiness and joy and love are good emotions, and then anger and fear and being sad or bad emotions. But like you mentioned two emotions that Jesus had, which was an anger in the temple and then a sadness in John 11, which we associate with negative emotions, actually in the proper context and at the proper magnitude actually are proper and right. For example, if an injustice, gross injustice, whether it's a murder, a rape, some really defamatory accusation, and you were just happy about it, there'd probably be something mentally wrong. And even when Jesus says that blessed are those who persecute, rejoice and be glad because they persecuted you before you, doesn't mean that you should be like, oh yes, I love just being masochistic and let people persecute me. No, you would have the anger, and then you remember Jesus's words and you know what to do with that anger. You're like, oh
Yes.
yeah, they did this to Jesus, I can handle this. But to be happy that people are mistreating you is not what Jesus meant by that. What he meant was, in a state where normally you would just be unhappy and angry, you could have this deeper thought in the back of your mind, I can make it through this because I'm doing the right thing. And you can have a peace in the midst of your anger. So anger in of itself lots of times get labeled as negative. It just, if you misdirect it, like you said, over, cause it to do things that are destructive instead of constructive with your anger, that's when it becomes immoral. Or you're angry just because it's a personal slight, or it's, I didn't get my raise that I deserved, and it's a selfish
Yeah.
reason.
Right. And the Bible, it says be angry and sin not. And
Mm.
so it's making that differentiation between the action and the emotion.
Mhm.
I like what you said right there, Nate. It's what you do with it. It's what you do with that emotion, right? Your first gut reaction is to feel a certain way, but you can choose joy, choose another emotional experience by flipping your perspective. And that goes to kind of state the point that we are by nature, like we said, emotional people. And so we're going to have a reaction no matter what. To try to state that, like you say, we're going to be Vulcan is to attempt an impossibility, which we shouldn't even be trying to attempt, but
Mhm.
rather redirecting our whatever experience to be appropriate to that particular context. And you've already mentioned that, being angry in a time of gross injustice. I remember I was at a movie theater once, and I was watching a film called Lord of the Rings. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that, but at one point, an arrow, someone gets shot with an arrow, and I hear this little laugh behind me. And I look back, and someone had brought their kid into the movie. Couldn't have been more than 3 years old. And I remember having such a negative reaction to that experience. Now there were two emotions. There was, it would seem to be the positive emotion of joy from this child, and my seemingly negative emotion of anger and disappointment and frustration.
Mhm.
But in that context, I still feel that the negative emotion was correct, and a positive emotion at seeing the suffering from such a young age was negative. And I feel that was right, and that was righteous, and that was a good emotional reaction.
So there's, I guess you could say, an example of why, or an example where you can see this, that there's a lot of shame, I think, in Christian culture towards emotions. And what you guys have explained is hey, this is part of being human. We were created with emotions. Jesus had emotions, and he sinned not. um,
Mhm.
but I'm just thinking, back sometimes as I've preached in different or spoken in different contexts. There's, you walk into church and there's like this silence, and sometimes people won't even respond, even if they're like juiced up on the inside, like excited. They won't respond audibly, and I wonder if that's also perhaps some of the, now some cultures respond a lot in church, and that could be a cultural thing, but it's almost as though the closer we come to God, the more emotionless we become in this idea. So I'm just curious if you guys could maybe speak to that. Maybe what's some history behind that? Do you guys know why people view this view of God being like so like stoic, and like you said, was it Spock? I'm not really a Star Trek fan, but to use that illustration, just emotionless being. And where does that come from? And I guess, yeah, how does that play out?
Well, I do think that Christianity, and actually Judaism,
Mhm.
before that, was heavily influenced by Greco-Roman thought, which uh, a lot of it attacked emotions as being not a good thing. And then the conception of God by Plato and Aristotle started moving towards this kind of, because a lot of people think, oh, they believed in Zeus and all that, but the philosophers were believing in a monotheism, and their view of God and the way they viewed perfection couldn't have emotion because that would mean change, and change would mean it wasn't perfect. So that kind of
Mm.
came in. And so I think when people were trying to be holy, and then you had the monasticism and the asceticism coming in, they wanted to be like God, and salvation to a lot of the early Christians was like this idea of theosis, becoming like God. So if God didn't have emotions, then we should get rid of them too. And so there became this idea, and that probably affected the worship services in Europe, to try to be places where you could where the prayer, which is actually probably more like meditation, could be a place where you could get rid of your emotion. And other contexts that are more emotional, that they didn't have that Greco-Roman influence, so they're more joyful, or there was just a different reaction. So that's to me what happens. And then now I don't even think that I think there's also the dynamic of extroversion, introversion. So I think that sometimes, for me being an introvert, I go into something that's very moving, and lots of times I internalize my emotion or my joy, but that, I am trying to express it outwardly in any kind of body movement would just be kind of fake and awkward. But that doesn't mean that someone who's more extroversion wouldn't have that.
Now, like your wife is
Right.
very
They, yeah,
like
yeah,
Expressive.
very
expressive.
expressive.
And so I remember we were having talks, and there's just, I don't think it was just cultural. I think
Mhm.
that, because sometimes we make it down to like a race line or whatever, like the Caucasians can't. I was like, I tell you what, I go to a church that's more expressive, and there's Caucasians that are getting into it. And I've seen people of more melanin endowed than I am also be very internalizing. So I think there's more to it than just culture or to Greco-Roman philosophy. I think that people handle their emotions differently.
Right. And I agree with that, but I do think a lot of it does depend on your culture, what you grew up. A lot of cultures tend to be more accepting of expression versus others. And so you will find people in a more Pentecostal a tradition much more open to being expressive. In fact, there's almost shaming of those who are non-expressive.
Mm.
And so you'll find, and then you'll find the flip side in other cultural traditions. I can tell you another factor that plays into it, however, is the concept of sanctity in the temple of God. And so when you're in God, you're in a holy place. There's this concept of reverency, in which, God needs to be respected, and therefore you need to be quiet and hate your life.
Hate your life?
And hate your life, yeah, and just be like, oh, I'm a terrible person, woe is me, come into his presence penitent. And so there is a time and a place.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look through the book of Psalms, there's definite lamentations and different times to be penitent, but whenever it talks, the majority of the time it talks about being in God's presence is one of joy, with music and dancing and jumping up and down, because you are in the presence of something that brings you joy. And so I definitely don't think it's an one or the other. I think there is a definite time and a place. To say, though, however, that every time should be as reverent, quiet, and emotionless as possible is not correct and not biblical. There are times when you need to tone it down a bit, maybe even times during the program versus others. But there, if to answer your question, where it's kind of coming from, I think it's a combination of, I think personality is valid. I think culture is also valid, but I also think the concept of what God is expecting of you is a big one.
It's kind of funny that you're mentioning that, because all I could think about was Jesus cleansing the temple. And you can't, like, I can see someone, see, there was all the money changing, the bleeding of animals, and it was just disrespectful. But ultimately, I think Jesus is more upset at the exploitation of the poor, because he didn't say, oh, you've made my house a loud cacophony of noise. He said you made it a den of thieves.
Mm.
And he flipped the thing
right.
over, and then immediately people rush in and he's healing them. And I don't think they were just calmly, impassionately, after they're healed, walking out. So it's not like it went from no noisy to no noise. It went from one kind of noise to another kind of noise.
Right. And I think and just to back up your point, in the Gospel of Mark, it adds the line, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations.
Mhm.
Because if you know where Jesus is doing that, where they made their storehouse, their market was the court of the Gentiles, and it was the only court where Gentiles could come to church and worship. And so the place where they were the only place where the nations could worship God. It was no longer used for that purpose. And
Interesting.
so it was not so much the loudness, as you say. It wasn't so much that there was all these things going on. It was the fact that worship was no longer happening there.
And I think it was it in the Gospel of Luke that says it was when he came to the doves, which was the doves were what were sold to the poor people, and that's when he like cut loose. Is like to reaffirm the justice and the other point you guys are making.
And so I think I didn't mean to sound like personality choice was the main reason why there wasn't emotions, because I do think culture has a play. And this all goes back to, I think people need to be able to express themselves and how they're feeling to God appropriately. And it creates some difficulty because I do, if you really have a burden and you have prayer and you're coming to the church and then somebody's like super happy and they're rightfully happy, it can create some clashes of emotion. So I sometimes, as a pastor, I was like, I decided to make a prayer room so that there could be a place where people could go to have reverent quiet, where they could have that place. And to me, sanctuary was a place of joy and worship, but there needed to be a place, a space in the church for that. And I think it's difficult because there is that time for, hey, I feel bad, I need to go someplace and pour my heart out to God. And yeah, you should be able to do it in your home, but there's something that maybe to have a prayer partner. So it's all about how we use our space. And now, of course, we can't use any of it because we're stuck at home. But there is something to having spaces that are designed for certain emotional proper reactions to God.
Right. And when I have had the ability to design my own programs, one thing that I've tried to do is split up the song service to have more praise music at the beginning to have an experience of joy. And I will try to do some testimony time and praises during that time. And then later on transition the songs to a more slow pace, just to get into a more reverent type of experience. So to provide space for both, or within the same program. It doesn't always happen, but I feel that the balance of the two within the same one, so you do reach the people that are coming, jumping for joy, excited about stuff going on in their life, but also the ones that are coming because they needed to come to church just to find some healing. You know, there's space for both people. And I do believe there is space for both people within church.
And it's funny that you mentioned about the space for both people in church. I remember when Hanani and I were getting to know each other and we went to church service and she just wanted to stand up and like, yeah. And then I just sat there. I wouldn't stand up. And she's like, you need to stand up. And she was like full out judging me. And by the grace of God, I would have judged her probably 5 years before that, but I had a different thought and came to that. And so I didn't judge her, though the old Nathaniel would have judged her harshly and I probably would have walked out of the service. But we had this talk and it just came to the realization that we were both worshiping. We just did it differently. I internalize to take things in. If a song really hits me, I don't want to stand up and jump around. I just want to sit back and take it in. And this even went back before, you know, when I was listening to music that just, there's no excuse for it, you know, going to like heavy metal rock concerts and there'd be guys next to me and they were like, we're going to beat you up if you don't sing to the song. And I'm like, I didn't come here to pay tickets to hear you sing. I want to hear the band sing. And so I didn't want to, you know, I just wanted to take it in. So we got in this argument. We came to the conclusion that we each worship in our own way right next to each other. And it's perfectly fine.
Right.
Love that.
So we're about finished here, but we're going to do another episode here quick. But this is great content, great insights, guys. Appreciate it. Any last comments on this section that you'd like to say to wrap up your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just like to say this. recognize that worship is not just about you, but rather about the whole of the people around you. So even though you may not be getting the type of worship experience that is yours, this worship is not meant to be a consumerist thing where I go where I can worship the best. Worship is about coming together and worshiping the same God. It's about God and about the group. And
Mm.
so even though you might not be getting the blessing, be flexible enough to recognize when a blessing is happening to those around you.
And just to build on that thought, automatically, if you are depriving yourself for the other, you are being a blessing and being blessed. So church should be about the other and should be about serving. So too much of this is selfish. Like, if I don't have this or that in my worship service, I'm not worshiping here.
Mm-hmm.
We make idols out of so many things, whether it's the musical instrument that you want or don't want, or a certain prayer in service. I moved the doxology out because I didn't understand it in the flow of that particular church. I have nothing against doxology. I think it's fine. I just think sometimes it's chanted without meaning. And so we took it out because that's how they felt. And I had a church member boycott the service. And I was like, why? In fact, this happened twice at two different churches, and they decided to do that. And they said, you remove God out of the service. And I'm not covering that because the doxology is not God. That's idolatry. And so that's an important point.
We've covered some good territory. Human emotions, Jesus and emotions, emotional expression, and church service. Good stuff, guys. Looking forward to the next episode.
Thank you,
All right,
Jeff.
thank you.